Right, so the cardiac cycle, we have systole and diastole. Systole is when the ventricles are contracting, so when the right ventricle is contracting and sending blood to the lungs, and at the same time the left ventricle is contracting and sending blood to the rest of the body. So we have our pulmonary circulation and we have our systemic or peripheral circulation as blood is ejected from the left ventricle. And diastole is when the atria are contracting and the blood is being ejected down into the ventricles and the ventricles are relaxed. And so during diastole is when we have filling of the left ventricles, and systole is when they're contracting and ejecting the blood out of the ventricles. So during systole, blood is being forcibly ejected out of the heart and into the arteries, and that puts pressure on the artery wall. And this is what we call systolic blood pressure. It's the higher number. And diastolic blood pressure is when the ventricles are at rest and there is still blood in the systemic system, in the systemic circulation, but it's exerting a lower amount of pressure against the artery wall because the blood is not forcibly being propelled into the artery. And we have something called peripheral resistance, and this is how much resistance is in that systemic circulation for the left ventricle to push against, to push the blood into the arteries. And that is variable, and it depends on things such as how the arteries, if they're vasoconstricted, which means narrowed, or if they're dilated, they're opened up. So obviously, if they're dilated, there's going to be less resistance. The type of exercise we do affects resistance. When we do weightlifting, we have greater peripheral resistance as opposed to doing some type of an endurance activity. Sympathetic stimulation also will stimulate the blood vessels to dilate, and it will divert more blood to our muscles. Things that are occurring in the muscles, such as nitric oxide expression, those are things that affect the resistance. And then the environment that we exercise in or that we're in. When it's cold out, we tend to constrict to our periphery, rather than when it's warm out, we tend to dilate the arteries to our periphery. And so this is just a slide that shows what an artery looks like when it's constricted or narrowed versus vasodilated. You can see there's going to be less resistance if we're ejecting blood into a dilated artery system. We have something called rate pressure product, and that's calculated based on the heart rate and the systolic blood pressure. And we call it the double product. And it's an indication of how much oxygen the heart muscle is demanding. So obviously, if we have a higher rate pressure product, it's more work for the heart. It requires more oxygen because the heart's beating faster, but also with higher pressures, it has to work harder to push against that higher pressure. And then we also have mean arterial pressure, and that is not just an average between the systolic and diastolic because we tend to be in diastole longer than systole. So it's an equation that calculates what is the average pressure exerted against our artery walls. And we need arterial pressure because it's also the pressure in the arteries that pushes the blood through the vessels. We have a measurement called stroke volume, and the stroke volume is the amount of blood that is ejected from the heart, from the left ventricle, with each beat of the heart. So the strength of the contraction of that heart muscle will affect the stroke volume, as well as how much blood was emptied down into the ventricle. If the ventricle is very full of blood, we're going to have a greater stroke volume. So the stroke volume is calculated by end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. And the end diastolic volume is how much blood is in that left ventricle after diastole. After all the blood's drained from the atrium into the ventricle, what's the volume of blood? And minus the end systolic volume. So the amount of blood that remains in that left ventricle after systole. Not all the blood gets pumped out when the heart contracts. So that's a calculation for our stroke volume. And stroke volume is very important with exercise because as we exercise, we need more blood to be sent to our working muscles, and we do increase our stroke volume when we exercise. We also have a calculation called cardiac output, and our cardiac output is our stroke volume, how much blood is ejected out of the left ventricle with each beat of the heart times the heart rate. So cardiac output is a total amount of blood that's ejected in 1 minute's time, whereas stroke volume is the blood that's ejected out of the heart with just one beat of the heart. And so this just shows the difference at rest, where most of our cardiac output is sent to. So at rest, the greatest portion of our cardiac output is sent to our digestive organs. And then when we're exercising, you can see that the far majority of our cardiac output, 70 to 85% of the blood, is diverted to our working muscles. We also have a measurement called preload and afterload, and those affect the stroke volume and the cardiac output. Preload is a measure of the volume of blood that enters the ventricles. So the preload is greatly affected by how much blood returns to the right atrium from the extremities and the trunk. So if we have blood that remains pooling in the veins, we have a diminished preload. And then afterload is how hard the heart has to work, what's the resistance that it has to overcome to eject the blood into the systemic circulation. And so some things that do increase the preload or increase the amount of venous return, one of the mechanisms is our muscles contract against our veins and help milk the blood back to the right atrium. They increase venous return because the veins are under lower pressure than the arteries. So there's a greater tendency for blood to pool or be stored in the veins. Another mechanism is when we breathe. We alter the pressure in our chest cavity, and this also puts pressure on the veins to help return the blood back to the heart. Our veins have valves that close, so when we have pressure put on the veins, the blood is pushed back against gravity, going back towards the heart, and then the veins close, that the blood won't flow backwards. Another thing that affects the stroke volume is the Frank-Starling principle, which just is the principle that as a myocardium is stretched, as the blood fills into the left ventricle, and the more blood that fills into the left ventricle, it stretches the fibers of the left ventricle, and that results in a stronger contraction of the left ventricle. So you're going to have a greater stroke volume. As athletes train, they get a greater volume in size of their left ventricle. They also have a greater blood volume. So those are things that are going to increase the preload, filling of the ventricle, stretching the fibers, and resulting in a stronger stroke volume. So more blood can be sent to the working muscles. And our circulation, as we pick up oxygen from the lungs and it's deposited into the blood and returns to the left atrium and to the left ventricle. Once the left ventricle contracts, it sends the blood out through the arteries And then they, as we get closer to our tissues and organs, um, they they branch into smaller arterioles and then branch into smaller capillaries. And it's at the capillary level that we see gas exchange into the muscle. So we see oxygen being delivered to the muscle, and it's exchanged. It picks up the carbon dioxide as a waste product at the muscle and delivers the oxygen. And then the carbon dioxide in the capillaries um, goes up into the venules, which are small veins, and then into larger veins, which then return the blood back to the heart.